We're just waiting to hear from Jay, who's supposed to let us know whether he's going to present or not. But if that's the case, so the rule is one person presenting, right? Erika, it's one person that will present.
Easier. Yeah. Okay, are we ready for the first? Yeah. We good? We are online? Are we online?
I think they're sorting out an issue with Carlos, but he's not presenting in the first group.
Okay. Hello everyone to the third plenary of the Project Design Session 2021. Today we are going to have a presentation of 4 teams, and the first of them is going to be Unnaturally Human, with some extra additions to the team from this morning. So who will be presenting from your team? Jay, are you there?
Hey, Jay, are you online?
I am.
Yeah. Do you feel okay to present from the online link?
Yeah, if it's good. Sure.
Okay, Jay.
Yeah. So in this case, I gave the file to Dmitry, but in this case, you'll probably have to share from your screen, I guess, so that you can control the PowerPoint.
Let me see.
Or the other way is you ask Dmitry to run through the slides.
Yeah, let me just ask Dmitry to.
Okay, wonderful, Jay. So since we are online, let's start 10 minutes for a presentation by the team and then Q&A with the board. Ready to go. Hi, Makia.
Okay, first slide. Dmitry. Okay, as you already know, our team is a naturally human, enhancement and manipulation of human capacity to perceive and perform. Next slide. So in discussing just the nature of our topic and what's encompassed in our topic, we stayed consistent with what the team has already been using, with the recognition that we might change the subtitle as the topic develops further. Go ahead, next slide. So starting off, a question that's been reoccurring throughout this process of PDS is what is the nature of human? We talked about some of the basic definitions of what it is to be human, talking about the cultural aspects of it, the way that culture has changed the definition of humanity over time, who we recognize as human, looking at bioevolutionary aspects of how we define what is human now, where we now have some debates about whether Denisovians or Neanderthals are human, and then the historical constructions associated with the nature of humanity. We have various perspectives because we come from different disciplines and how we view it, and different educational experiences. So one aspect of being human that seems most pertinent as we project into the future is what is life itself for human? What consists of human life? Is it based on the combination of our mind and our body, or as we kind of medically recognize now, that if the mind is still alive, then the person is still alive. And if the mind is dead, but the body's alive, then the person no longer exists. And what this might mean as we project into the future, as we move into what seems inevitable if we stay on the technological trajectory that we're on, that our minds will be more and more able to be divorced from our sensual bodies. And so how is that going to affect the life? Or as artificial intelligence begins to become autonoetic and become self-aware, how will that affect our definitions of life and what it means to be human? And so those boundaries are things that we need to be preparing for intellectually now. And of those boundaries, we say, what then are the boundaries of being human? And again, we're looking at that relationship between being human as a product of all those sensory inputs that are then processed through our neurological unit. So we want to examine what those boundaries are as well. Or again, we come from it from different perspectives, but we recognize overall that there are boundaries. They're just not super well defined in some areas. And then I think we had a kind of agreement that terms like post-humanism or transhumanism are kind of artificial constructs that try to suggest that there's something outside those boundaries. And what we're saying is it's all within those boundaries. We just need to define what those boundaries are. And so some of those terms can be used in a negative way to dehumanize or post-humanize different types of life or humanity. So these were some of the framing definitions that we worked with. Go ahead, next slide. So in developing the topics for the group, we were looking at some basic suppositions. One is that there's a radical transformation happening in human nature, and that we're moving with the modifications of humanity that are changing. The dynamics of being human, that within the physical limitations of our senses and our neurological capacities, our intellectual capacities are changing at an exponential rate. And that when we look at the biotechnological foundations of these changes, that there's a lag between our cultural development. And so cultural lag, which has been discussed a lot during the 20th century, but probably not enough because we haven't really come to terms with how we're going to move culture in association with these biotechnological changes. So this disconnect between culture and our biological and technological advances. So we believe that there are severe consequences to society and to humanity related to this cultural lag, which can result in disaffection of individuals, dangerous international competitions, dangers of exploitation, manipulation, social pathologies, dystopian futures that can be brought about by out of control rapid expansion of cultural voids, the sort of adaptive radiation of ideas and technologies into open niches. So there's no controls within the sort of intellectual or behavioral ecological system that can result in all sorts of dangerous advances in the application of the technology. We see it in warfare recently. For instance, there's the use of whether we will accept as a world the use of artificial intelligence being able to make the decision of killing people in weapons. And so this disassociation of the sensual and ethical decision making associated with the taking of human life, are we willing to abdicate that to a machine? And I believe the United States refused to sign a compact on that very issue just in the last week or so. And the other issues that this comes about and sort of the negative manifestations of what we're seeing in the Anthropocene, predatory capitalism, economic disequilibrium, access to medical resources, the quality of life of individuals. And we saw all these as kind of aspects of the exploitation of this acceleration that's going on in this bio and technological dynamic period that we're in. Next slide. So putting forth a hypothesis or some research questions. What is the role of technological acceleration on the enhancement of human nature and capacity? And in what ways do the changes in the biological and technological aspects of culture create dissonance, disaffection, and incongruencies in society? So we're looking at this acceleration. And a lot of times when you look at the modeling of the Great Acceleration, well, you can look at socioeconomic factors, or you can look at physical manifestations, material manifestations, such as the amount of carbon put into the atmosphere, socioeconomic factors like the amount of international tourism, what we're saying is if we look at the sensory world, if we look at our sensual aspects, we can do the same sort of graphing of this great acceleration. If we look at the range of visual acuity that we have, the ability to hear, through the augmentation of our senses, that we can see that the acceleration can be applied as much to our sensual world as it is to these other material or socioeconomic factors. And the consequences for the Anthropocene in the acceleration of our sensory enhancements is just as profound as it is in the other aspects of society, as it is in the material and the socioeconomic. So that individual and collective enhancement of our sensual understanding of reality is dramatic and as important to study as the other aspects of the great acceleration that define the Anthropocene. All right, next slide, please. So we looked at some of the existing sources and some things that we had experience with, or some that we found as we did some basic research. And you can see there's a couple of sources looking at the acceleration and the impact on the world. As I said, a lot of these, the characteristics of what's called the Great Acceleration define the Anthropocene. The cultural lag, the discontinuity between society and technology, which, they were talking about in the 1920s, and of course, this is, since 1950, and this has been going up at a continually exponentially growth rate. That means that culture is just not evolved, it's not developed in a way to keep up with the pace with that. So there's a history of study on the topic beginning back to 1920s. McLuhan and Carlos Scolari, again, just a series of authors who dealt with some of these topics. I won't go through all of them. Some of them I don't know. So if you have questions, we can address to specific members of the team. Go ahead to the next.
Yeah, 1 more minute.
Okay. Biotechnological evolution versus cultural evolution. So general problems that we address, a lot of those were covered up in the suppositions. Go ahead, next slide, since we're out of time. Looking at some of the specific problems, different areas that we can look at, geographical, the types of technologies, VR technologies, and video games. Let me get down to the last slide. I don't want to run out of time on that. Next slide. Again, just elaboration on more of the problems. Going down to the next slide. So outputs and recommendations, looking at the different things, and particularly what Enrique, Tyler, and Stanimir can contribute. Again, we'll have to deal individually with those topics. And then the last slide, I think. So the specific work and the distribution, I think this is kind of the framework of everything that we're talking about. So the first set of problems that we want to deal with are the means of defining the problem. Is the problem real, or is it just a theoretical construct, a meaningless exercise? So we'd want to defend the trends that associate with the acceleration and the enhancement of being human. And then we'd want to support that through trend analysis and through case studies. Then we would have ways of collecting new data that illustrate the issues, that show how it's manifest in the current time with the technologies and the people that are on the earth now, things that we have access to from our position at SAS. And then the final thing would be looking at objectives and outcomes. Why are we doing this? What are our goals? First thing is to demonstrate that this is a real problem that's worth addressing. And the second thing would be to come up with recommendations and activities for influencing society. Now, obviously, all these many of these activities are already in process and happening, but they need to be highlighted, and their effect on the problem need to be analyzed. And so this, again, is where we looked at where the new members of the team would be able to make specific contributions. So 10 minutes is an awful short time for this, but yeah, I think I am done.
Thank you very much, Jay, for your presentation. I am wondering, maybe Machiel would like to ask the first question, who is joining us today.
Good morning from Amsterdam. Thanks for the presentation. I realize I'm jumping in a couple of days of intense collaborations, exchanges of ideas, of which I was happily a witness in the previous session, but due to Corona, I'm now responding from home. Yeah, I have a couple of remarks and a question. I really listened with interest to what you've been saying, what you've been telling. Maybe let me put it this way. I'm a little bit curious to the lack of focus, if I may put it like that, in the early parts of your presentation, which somehow draws together several lines of research on the Anthropocene of extended cognition, as we would refer to it in cognitive neuroscience. So the integration of external tools in our cognition and behavior, etc. Then your discussion of the cultural lag, which is understandable and it might be acute. Then only actually in the final parts of your presentation, when it came to the outputs, I got a sense of what maybe the specific expertise of the three of you is that you are bringing to the table, and also the focus that this project might move into. Since if I captured it correctly in a very quick moment that you showed the slide, all three of you seem to focus on the senses. And it is actually the lack of focus that I was really sensing in the early parts of the presentation. Also thinking, well, what really new is it in the project that you're doing? For instance, I was a little bit disappointed by the fact that you're still, in a way, putting a very anthropocentric focus on this, not considering it as a systems approach, which might be yielding some new insights. But then when I discovered that all of you were interested in really what happens to the senses or the contributions to the senses, then I thought, well, maybe if you would really focus there and would show how the extended cognition, but also the sociocultural changes in our processes. We know, for instance, that the fact that we are much more online, in line, etc., really makes the different sensory perception modes giving an unequal contribution to the input in our cognitive system. So we are less able to tap from other senses. Maybe there are geographical differences also. So in a way, my question maybe is somewhat more of a challenge. So how could you make this somewhat more specific and innovative, maybe by focusing really on the shared interest that you seem to have in the implications of these developments for the senses, in our sensory perception?
Yes, I don't want to deprive of the floor the new members of the team, so I will be very quick. So yes, thank you for this remark and this suggestion. Actually, it has been one of the first items of our discussion today. The fact that targeting the senses, it's actually a very useful way for tackle this broad and unfocused question of how humanity through what kind of transformation humanity is going. Because, well, senses are the perfect link between mind and body, and a perfect target, one of the most targeted human aspects of human nature, targeted by recent technological and scientific evolution. So this is the reason of our choice. In terms of being even more specific and even more focused, well, we discussed, for example, about how much of the recent technology that is provoking major changes in our perceptions, behavior, is visual. From the smartphones to VR technologies to the fact that in 2 years we have been having Zoom in our daily life. And how this is changing not just our visual perception, but also all the other senses, because they do not work in isolation. And in that sense, it's a great target, we believe, to put our expertise together, because it's not a topic that can be studied in isolation. It has been studied in isolation, but then the literature that has been produced, it's because it's so disciplinary focused, by its own nature limited. And we would like to go beyond these limitations, and this is the reason of existing, basically, of our team. So, finished.
Do the candidates want to add something?
I can start.
Sure.
Thank you for the question. So a couple of things. First thing is a comment and then the answer, or a response rather. I'm not sure I understood exactly the point on anthropocentrism, and I don't want to waste time and ask you for a follow-up, but I think there is very often a conflation, and that comes, at least analytically, to me, it's very helpful when that conflation is happening. So Catherine Hales discusses the difference between anthropomorphic and anthropocentric. And in a discussion in one of her papers, she tries to explain why this confusion is important. And I think when we're talking about our team in particular, it's very, if you imply that, I agree. I'm not sure, but it's very easy to conflate the two, what's anthropomorphic and what's anthropocentric. And the ethical charge of these two terms is, can be quite different depending on what you want to achieve. At any rate, our team is dealing with human activity, and I think to the extent to which this is human activity, and we try to look at it and measure through the senses, we are invariably anthropocentric. So in that regard, that's kind of fine. But some of the stuff that are happening and we want to explore are more on the line of thinking about anthropomorphism rather than anthropocentrism. So if we keep that distinction, that might be very helpful. So I'll stop here because I don't want to eat more time.
Yes, I suggest we move to the next question, Alexander. Preferably to our new candidates.
Yeah, the question will be to new candidates, but it would be directed to all new candidates. So basically I have two questions. These questions are somewhat interconnected. First, from the last slide of your presentation, where you described your potential contribution, I felt, I had a feeling that the new members are somewhat detached from the whole team. I mean, I approximately understand what they are going to do, but I do not understand how this would change research action of, well, so to speak, incumbent, how new entrants would change the research action of incumbent researchers of that group. So this is the first. So what your research would change in research of older players of that group, how you believe that, right? So how you think that. And the second question is as follows. I've seen a lot of activities about collecting data, and then some activities about presenting convincing evidence to the public about that data. But I do not understand what methods are you going to apply to that data to construct this convincing evidence. So this is the second question, the question about methods. Yeah, so first, how you believe you will change the action of other members of that group, and the second is what methods you're going to apply to data.
Who will start?
I mean, I can go first. I have my hand up. For the first question, like how I think my role is going to kind of enhance things and kind of build on the team. I think first, my thought is in terms of Karine, she's done all this amazing work on vision and vision impairment throughout history. And one thing I want to work on specifically is this notion of augmented reality, right? Kind of an altered vision through our devices, right? Whether we're playing games, whether we're taking tours, how does this new vision through our phones that adds new elements to the reality affect the way we are a part of a community or how we see the world around us? And then building on this, kind of interconnected to Jay's work on like the physical spaces as archaeology, like here, even though we're not physically altering the space, we're altering how we perceive that space, right? So here, we're not only our vision being altered, we're also altering these spaces by adding in creatures, we're adding new elements of design, virtual graffiti, whatever it happens to be. We're really changing these particular aspects of our perceptions. And I think for my research, it'll build on both of those things. And of course, I think over the past couple of days, I've learned me and Enrique overlap quite a bit in terms of our interest in media, and like for him, his kind of interest in video games. And then Stanimir, he kind of notes that he wants to work on out of bodies experience. And one thing I thought about in terms of this augmented reality was the notion of kind of traveling through time, right? If we could pick up our phones, maybe we see what Moscow used to look like 100 years ago. Maybe we see what Paris looked like 100 years ago. And how might that relate to our kind of understanding of that sense of place? Like when we're traveling through these different times, how does it affect us? So I think that's the thing I would bring on. And of course, for me, ethnography and interviews are my go-to ways of getting my data.
Yeah, and if I may, I would add to that. Basically, with what Tyler just said, I mean, one of the elements would be observation. One of the things that we describe is, for instance, this kind of generational shift, and then see how people react differently depending on their age to certain stimuli. For instance, in a video game or virtual reality, and how that plays out in something that you can observe, as well as, for instance, from media studies, what have been the recurrent tropes about fear of technology, and how that plays out in how people react to this processes. So it could be done, as Tyler was also pointing out, through the interviews and through the debates of why do you think then that this is what's going to affect you? And as you know, there's always this kind of eternal fear of the next medium coming up. So virtual reality now would probably be the evil, as it was social media, and before that video games, and before that television, and before that, because that is kind of that generational shift that, as Jay was mentioning, seems to be narrowing down, that it is, you might be out of whack within a year with the new technology coming up. So we could do this by observation in certain environments, and we could do this through interviews on how they feel about in relation to that technology and how that technology makes them feel in that sense, but also in the sense of seeing how they experience it and how that becomes part of their normal sensitive perceptions, and whether they link that to other kind of idea of senses, including those that might be foreign. In the case of what Michael was asking, if people who have extra added elements to their body and how they describe those within the limits of how we've been able to describe senses, which is something also very interesting when you see those people that have added implants and then how they try to describe it, because they say, well, this is a new sensation I have, how can I describe it to you? So that would be some of our tools, I would say, to gather the information and to link it to what we're doing, just adding to what Tyler was mentioning.
Okay, is there any other voice?
Since it's for the new members, I'll try to be quick. I think one thing that might have not been very well articulated in the presentation today, but it started on Friday actually, was that the team is already changing for all of us. Now we're 5, we were 6 back then, now we're 5. And today this was kind of radicalized, and it seems like what happened was that the problem of acceleration really loomed large, and this is the one problem that now seems to kind of rewrite, in a way, the focus of the group. The reason why I'm mentioning this is because I have a personal interest and stake on the problem of acceleration. And we had a debate today, a discussion today on where did this problem came from. It comes from debates in energetics, actually, in the 1950s, especially in Germany. The other thing that I want to mention, so this point was just about the fact that there's something that's already happened to the team as it is in its new composition. Effectively, it's been changed over a couple of days. And as for me personally, on methods in particular, I would say the non-philosophy that I mentioned yesterday, we did have a discussion on the human today, and we agreed that we'll be using competitive theories. more or less, at least in the beginning. One thing I just want to mention is what I'm going to try to be doing is to introduce Laruel's notion of generic human, the generic humanity. We don't have the time to explicate it now, but it's a very specific articulation of what the human is, and it's a form of critique of exactly these ideologies of trans and post-humanism. So on a methodological level, I'll be probably also trying to work out something out of that.
Okay, in the spirit of acceleration, Andrew.
So I'll try to be accelerated. So I think the issue that we're surrounding with these questions is there's two things that could be happening, and probably only one of them is happening. So one, there could be a problem you're trying to solve. So let's say there's this cultural lag, and we will provide solutions for diminishing the cultural lag by using the data that we collect. Or we're going to describe it. We're going to collect data, we're going to see what people do, we're going to see how they, and that's going to sort of fix the fact of the problem, right? So I think the problem of this presentation is that the beginning that Jay showed were all the things that were issues that ask to be solved, right? We have this cultural lag. We don't, our senses or our understandings haven't caught up, our culture hasn't caught up to reality. So we could either be providing people with some ideas for how to close that gap, right? If that's the problem, or that's a set of problems, right? Then we should be doing that. Or we can say, no, well, we still don't, we vaguely feel that that's going on, but we actually need just to collect lots more data and look at it and then see how it's happening, right? So I think the second part is easier in a way, right? Each of you can go find stuff out and watch stuff and observe stuff and say, oh yeah, this is what happens when blah, blah, right? And then there's the question of like, okay, so is there a, quote, public policy side? Do we do anything with this? Do you want to do anything with this? Can you do anything with this? Can you even make a hand-waving gesture in the direction of doing this? And that's what I didn't hear. I heard the problem, I heard the observation, but I didn't hear the hand wave like, oh, and we will, because of what we know, we will now be able to X.
That was on the last slide of the presentation.
Maybe you could articulate it a little bit better.
Yeah, sorry, I know given the acceleration, maybe we all missed things, but we had Jay and Tyler, do you want to respond to that? Because on the last slide, we also had recommendations, so sort of going towards policy, for example.
Yeah, let me let you guys, I'd love to, but I think you guys need to answer the new candidates.
Yeah, Tyler.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, one thing I think would be interesting is gathering data and seeing how people are adapting to these particular issues, right? Seeing the kind of ways they do this, and coming from there, once we see the best methods, it's easy to recommend policies. And one thing I thought about while doing a little bit of research while we were talking today was kind of issues related to this, but also in terms of issues related to identity. And one thing I thought about was my experience in Moscow and going through the Space Museum, this really, really amazing museum that's there. And I thought, how would it affect and how would it even bolster kind of the Russian identity to see someone like Yuri Gagarin through our phones in one of the capsules, or to see the first 2 dogs in space, and to see these kind of interactions? What kind of pride would that generate? So even as we're trying to catch up and deal with these cultural lags, maybe one policy we could have is to really highlight the good that can be done, right? We're going to highlight a lot of the bad in our research, but we can highlight some of the good that can be done for national pride, sense of identity. And I think for me, coming from the States, how many important cultural sites are gone from our native population? If we could pick up our phones and kind of recreate those spaces digitally, what kind of sense of self might that build? How might that help us understand what was once here and develop a sense of pride for a very marginalized group within my nation?
Enrique?
Well, I could see if there's, in the process of gathering that data and showing us how this is affecting, if it's really affecting to that regard or not, whether there should be any sort of impact or any modification, any policy recommendations regarding, for instance, the use of a certain technology. There should be any limitations that should be recommended from a health perspective. I don't know. But it would depend on the gathering of the data, whether that actually makes sense or not, whether that it's only a fear that we have through media and through this intergenerational difference, this acceleration, if that is only a fear or if it's actually something that happens. I mean, I know in the case of video games, the problem with numb hands for people playing for too long. And then basically you could just issue a recommendation, try not to play for more than X number of hours without some exercise in your hands, as you do for work, not sitting on a chair for too long. So obviously there could be some recommendations coming up on how to engage with this technology, but as to where or how strong they would be, whether they would need to be brought up to health institutions or just basically just recommendations that are general or brought up just to the media, well, it would depend on the data that we gather.
I think the business of collecting an observation and just gathering data is really respectable in and of itself, so there is nothing wrong about that. And I think we failed, I don't know, we tried to manifest that to some extent we'll be doing that. But I think just collecting and observing data and trying to, minimally intervene in it is not good enough for a place like SAS. Honestly, I think this is not what we want to do, and this is my feeling, as an individual and researcher. My feeling is that we want something of a mixed method between the two levels that you were describing. And the way we were working on the last slide, which was on the distribution of the work, and especially with the focus on me, Tyler, and Enrique, I think this is where we kind of started feeling that we can actually cover those two levels. Well, we can, compartmentalize in different ways, but I would agree with your distinction. So yeah, I think description is not enough, definitely, for this team.
Okay, who else has a question to this team? Olga.
I have a comment of a research question that put it in your project. If you look at the social sciences, there are thousands of books and concepts on the topic. Just as one example, Karl Marx 2 centuries ago explained us what happened between technological advancement and social relations. So my question, what is new contribution that your project really is going to do in this field? Just to collect some empirical cases or try to create a new general theory that will explain what's happened between technology and society in current situation? I think this is the question for new members rather than the old one. Yes, please. Tyler or Enrico?
I mean, I think my best answer to that would be, I think any of the previous research, any of the previous theories, there's always going to be updating as our world changes, right? I think of theories as kind of maps of the world. And for me, using the United States as an example, in 1849, if I had a map saying California had lots of gold, this would be the best map ever. If I try and use that map today, the map doesn't work quite as well because we've adjusted, we've learned from those ideas, things have changed around the world. So that map needs to be updated. So I think from us gathering the new data and understanding how people are interacting with this new perception, this new virtual reality, these new ways of engaging with the world can allow us to adjust, maybe not really fully recreate, but at least adjust and update the maps to kind of allow us to understand social life in our contemporary times a little bit better.
Yeah, I also think that the advantage of working interdisciplinary here would be what is really important, because from my disciplinary background, I know Marshall McLuhan and his theory of the development of media as extension of the senses and how he has described it. And how is that one that we use, some of us in media studies, this media ecology to understand then the media as extensions of our senses, all kind of technological developments of humans as extension of our senses, and how that then relates to other ways of looking at it, to the data that we collect, and to other perspectives that come into place that help refine that theoretical construct. Because as Tyler was mentioning, it seems these are different sides that we take from different angles to try to understand the relation between those elements. But if we look at it from these angles and we just stay on our path, we are not able to create a new, let's say, combination of interdisciplinary ideas to produce another or a different model, or I don't know, more complex one, or one that binds elements from different ones. So part of our idea would be to try to accommodate better the theories that we already know and that we already use, or to see if there is a need for a new one, because none of these things actually fit together. We need to develop a new one. But we would find that out as we start gathering the data and analyzing it from the different perspectives that we started to begin with, and then to start refining our own model as we develop it.
So I think for the purposes of this team, our contribution, the way I had a sense of it for the 2 sessions, the 2 days we've worked together already, is, this is a topic-driven project, and to the extent to which I believe we have a good and well-focused topic on the enhancement of the human senses. There's been a little bit of work, as I mentioned today, that seemed to make the focus even of the topic, and therefore the possible contribution even more pronounced, which is technological acceleration that has impact on the human senses. So the contribution that we'll be doing, I think, will be largely centered around that problem, and I think this is precisely what we need to do in terms of contribution in order to kind of address this problem of the cultural lack. That's been mentioned several times. And just the final point is, I don't think that the fact that we have tens of thousands of books in social sciences or humanities or both is the problem itself, for the simple reason that people don't tend to change their notion of human and humanity very often, right? So that inevitably leads all of us in social science and humanities in the position of, having to orient yourselves in, the wilderness. However, for us, this will be even more complicated when we try to do our contribution. This is my anticipation, for the simple reasons that if we, for example, take trouble issue with something like post-humanism, then it's, this is responsibilizing us rather than taking away responsibility.
Andre?
Yeah, I'm actually struggling with formulation of the question that I have. Because you see, it's very difficult to assess how your contribution to the existing knowledge on the topic would work if you don't tell us what's the problem with the current understanding of the topic, right? And you kind of was asked this question several times, right, from different kind of angles, and you kind of resist to reply to say that, well, no, everybody understands the problem from that like that, but we think it's wrong, and we are going to propose a different framework, for example, or different theories, except saying that everybody is monodisciplinary, which I think is simply wrong, because there are lots of interdisciplinary research, I'm sure, about such things as, human perception. So I will try a different direction of the question. So all of you come from your discipline, right? Can you tell us, and again, my question is for the new members for obvious reasons, right? To what extent participating in this project will help you develop your own discipline? Will help you move ahead media studies or sociology or philosophy that you couldn't do that move without participating in that project?
Tyler?
I think for me personally, the 2 things that come to mind for kind of my personal development and hopefully for my field as well is, one, kind of building on the work of Gary Allen Fine, who I kind of view as a really, really good contemporary ethnographer. He's gone from studying youth baseball teams to studying Dungeons and Dragons to studying restaurant workers. He's jumped from field to field. And through his jumping from field to field, he's really done a good job of refining kind of methodological theories, methodological ideas and practices, as well as really, really developing a strong understanding of the way he calls them idiocultures. I think an easy thing is just groups and their little cultures that go along with their groups, how they interact. And I think by me personally switching dramatically from skateboarding, which includes a little bit of visual aspects to it, but switching to something like this will force me to grow dramatically as a research scholar and hopefully push ethnography forward as I have to adjust my methods and adjust to this new field. And then the second part of your question, sorry, what was the second part?
Well, it was only one part.
Okay.
Enrique.
Okay, well, on the one hand, I would think that at some point when we do our studies, we tend to take for granted some of the concepts. And one of the best things that I found from the whole session was our debate. Are we going to debate about what a human being is because of the general kind of, I don't know if innocent, naive acceptance of what a human is and what the senses are. But even one of the questions just brought forth the idea that we have a certain number of senses or that our senses are these, and that is what they include and what they do not depends of a normative creation of the idea of how we are designed as humans. And that also comes from a historical perspective that Corinne works on how we've defined what our most important senses are and why, and how they're normatized to a certain degree. With what we've been discussing with Jay is how both his profession has changed because of the appearance of certain technology that allows him to see things that they were not able to see before, at least not directly from where you're sitting, to how through in other moments as well, we try to alter the places that we were in order to provide certain sensory experiences that were meant something to you. So something that is akin to how we try to create in new media products some form of excitement of the senses in these products to elicit a different response. So I think that what enriches me and my knowledge is that you usually in your discipline tend to focus on, okay, this is already something that you expect to be like this. And you talk about vision in a way that you think that it's not contestable and vision means this. And in that sense, this interdisciplinary dialogue, what produces it, that makes you go out of those boundaries and feel uneasy about, how to respond to them, and raises new questions. So what if I thought of senses a bit differently and I had to create a new definition of what a sense is or how it is defined? What are the limits of it? And that creates for me a whole other set of questions, because it implies that all the research that I've done so far is based on a lot of assumptions that now I can question philosophically. And Stanimir is going to help us kind of try to navigate how we are questioning those definitions as I see appear and disappear magically in front of you through these video system. So I think that is what enriches and provides elements. And then from other experiences of how they feel like they deal with this sense, I think I could also learn a lot from Tyler's experience with ethnography and how people actually describe the things rather than just reading the product and trying to understand the product from a textual analysis.
Okay, Stanimir.
Thank you. I have probably two very short answers. One is, I think if I got the question okay, your question is about degree. So to what you ask, to what extent, right? Is this going to change your discipline?
In what way? It's not necessarily degree.
Okay, because if it's degree extent, I just don't know. I mean, because it's a new team, right? And I can't predict. But I have to say, so this might sound a bit off, but I have to say, a few years ago when I understood in my research that I'm on the wrong path and that I'm working on embodied cognition and embodiment in general, this was a big topic for many years for me, I realized I'm just on the wrong path. Everybody's doing research on embodied cognition and embodiment, and I realized nobody's doing research on disembodied cognition anymore. And so once I realized that and started working on this problematic, well, not nobody, very few people, very niche literature. Once I understood that, I got a sense of how this understanding is changing my field or my own philosophical analysis. And so, I mean, I say that my answer sounds a little bit off, because basically what I'm saying is that this process in a way has already happened for me as a person individually. It doesn't mean I'm a finished researcher with a finished research agenda or something, but basically what I'm trying to say is that what's going to happen, I think, with me in this particular team is rolling back on the problem of embodied cognition, because I think I've gone too far away from it in a way. So now I'm going to be having the chance to actually go back to problems of embodiment that I escaped from for my dissertation. So I think this is a very productive thing for me, and it will definitely kind of influence my research agenda in philosophy.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to this team. And now we are moving to anticipating futures. To our producers, since we have some conversations in the chat, but no one except for people online can see what's happening over there, it would be good to see it if something appears, so that 40 people in the room can follow that as well. All right, who will be presenting from this team? Peter, okay. You have 10 minutes from whenever you want to start. And if you can explain to everyone who is on the team, that will help.
I will
is that
explain
anticipating
the composition. No, the slide is wrong. It's the other group, Anticipating Futures.
Dmitry, Anticipating Futures.
Yeah, we resolved the technical problem. So, the first thing that I would like just to highlight is that nobody from the people that were engaged in the teams that have been disbanded joined our team, but at the same time, we have been talking with a series of colleagues, of candidates in the past days about the topic that we had in mind, and many of them would be perhaps interested in collaborating with us in the future. And as we all know, from this year, it will be possible for faculty to participate in more than one research project. So due to the lack of time today, because all of us, the three potential new members, have been working on a different project, we really couldn't work on developing the project that we presented yesterday in new directions. In this sense, what we aim to do is to address some of the questions that have not been fully answered yesterday, to clarify certain questions, to explain how we would like to expand the perspectives that are involved in our project. And at this point, the potential new members will have a chance to say how they might be interested in the project at hand. And then we will continue our conversation based on what we have presented yesterday. So first of all, the first point that we would like to address is regards to the specificity of our project. This is the question that Erika raised yesterday. And we would like, I will now give the floor to Siavesh, who will briefly present the methodological underpinnings and the specific theoretical framework on which we rely.
Yeah, I elaborate very schematically on what we mean by our methodology. I just have some few notes in front of me. I think it's going to take 2-3 minutes. So yesterday we mentioned that the state of the state of total crisis indicates not only catastrophe but also potentialities. And we also stated that this is based on determining the crisis as forms of appearance of the specific mode of human activity. We believe that to treat this question, we have to adopt a holistic approach. But we have to also specify what we understand by holism, or what is specific about our understanding of holism, which we think it is the dialectical character of our methodology. This requires looking at phenomena as if they are processes, but not mere things. Also, it should be emphasized that the main determinants of change lie within the system. This is also related to identifying the future within the present in form of potentialities. The basic moments of this method of dialectical abstraction are extension, level of generalization, and vantage point, to which yesterday we referred as perspective as well, if you remember from the slides. Extension refers to setting the limits of the phenomena to be analyzed in space and time. Level of generalization refers to analyzing the particular so that not only the particular, but also the whole to which it belongs can be treated. In a sense, this is to identify the general in particulars, the law that explains the unity in diversity. As for the vantage point, it refers to a place within the relationship from which to view, to think about, and to piece together the other components in the relationship. Meanwhile, the sum of their ties becomes a vantage point for comprehending the larger system to which it belongs. So basically, these are like the, I would say, in a very schematic way, the components of our methodology that we're trying to adopt in our project.
Thank you, Siavash. So yes, and this is what makes our project specific and distinctive, the reliance on this methodological approach and the reliance of this theoretical framework from other projects that might be exploring the Anthropocene, contemporary crisis, and so on. Now, the second question that we felt was very important regards the way in which we think our project can be expanded, which other critical perspectives might be incorporated in order to enrich it. And we were thinking in particular of three main fields that might be interesting for us to incorporate. One was the social sciences, secondly, literary criticism, and especially the narratives, sci-fi narratives, as those provide a view of the present in many ways, in many times, from the future, and this link is very something that we are very interested in. And we would also like to see whether there is possibility of incorporating a visual artist so that we can address the question of visualization, not only from a theoretical and critical perspective, but also in terms of production. And so we have been discussing this project in the past days, during breaks and so on, with Ksenia, Sky, and Mansa, who are involved in another project at the moment. But in the future, we hope that they might be willing to collaborate with us. And so I will briefly ask them if they can very briefly and schematically explain how they think that the project might contribute to their own scholarly work and how they believe that their work can enrich the project.
Okay, thank you. So yes, I'd like to confirm my interest to participate in the project. We had some conversations, with Liz, for example, that this, the systems approach or systems analysis is quite important and is needed. So, for example, one of the possibilities we can do is to have a comparative analysis of two different dimensions, like looking at the environmental crisis and the crisis happening in governance, and sort of looking at both as, at the ecosystem as the system, and also looking at the governance as the system, and understanding what structures are necessary to keep, kind of referring to the concept of resilience. So in a sense, if I think of an organism as a system, there might be a certain point when it's possible to go back and kind of restore its capacities, or it could be such a point that you can't go back. So this, and obviously this really relates to environmental crisis, but also, will be interesting to explore that and maybe compare with the with the governance in terms of, because we also know that's not just the environmental crisis, it's also the crisis in the decision making. So that will be quite interesting. I think it will be a breakthrough contributions in the field of public policy. And I will be very happy to learn more about the methodology in the dialectical abstraction. So I think it might be very fruitful collaboration.
May I?
Yep.
Yeah. So when Peter suggested, and when I heard yesterday's presentation, I thought it's interesting research project, not just for my field, but not just for their field of research, but it's very mutually productive. Because first of all, as far as I understand correct, in the yesterday's presentation and suggestion, they were trying to have this research about anticipating future in terms of ecology and environmental crisis, so forth and so on. However, the general public, if this kind of concept, this temporality and this notion of space is way broader than we normally think, right? At least it requires general public to think about in terms of not their city, but planet-wise. If possible, space, but at the same time, in terms of temporality, it requires Anthropocene thinking requires geological temporal thinking, right? So oftentimes, general public it doesn't feel like really crisis is in the near future, but it's something constantly delayed. So as a example, or as a imaginary example of the fiction writers, it can provide this good narrative example. So that's something I think my field can contribute to their research. But at the same time, when science fiction, especially the more specific genre, climate fiction or apocalypse fiction, when these writers and novelists write this fiction in a serious manner, some of them are have a research experience in science, but oftentimes the readers are thinking this is just fiction, this is just science fiction. So it's not something serious, it's not something realistic. So if I have the collaboration with ecologists such as Liz, then maybe I can have the useful tool to analyze what's really going on inside of this fiction narrative. So I think that's a kind of part that potential of the collaboration.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah. Is that okay? Yeah, I guess I think I've had a recent interest in looking at futures, but it was more the idea of potential futures in relation to memory and how memory shifts and what kind of shifts we see in the idea of trauma experience of memory and how that happens and how we can observe and anticipate what will happen with that. But also in relation to new developments that have been happening in contemporary art in relation to the use of nature as a medium, which is something that is only quite recently been developing, and it's still a really under-researched field that has been tentatively called nature art. And it's something that I've only recently got involved in, and very much relates to eco-criticism. And I think that my position as an artist and the kind of thing that I believe that I can add to this group is really relates not only to reflections and illustrations of the kind of new knowledge that's going to be building upon, but really using, kind of going back to this idea that's being developed as through nature art as a medium, using nature as a medium, here as using art as a medium of new knowledge, and the production of this new knowledge through the use of art as a method.
So thank you very much, Mansa, Sky, and Ksenia. I'm afraid that we might be running out of time. So I hope that we might continue the conversation now in the Q&A session. So the floor is yours.
Yes, I'm a bit confused. So there should be no questions to the...
They are not current members of the project, but they might be joining the project in the future.
Because if the board wants to ask questions about their potential.
No, but we haven't had the time to discuss this together because they were working on a different research project. No, they are in another. You will. Yes. They are a part of other projects. But they can collaborate on two, right? So
yes. So who has a question to the people visible here?
I would have a question, perhaps.
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, thanks for again an interesting, potentially interesting project. I'm a little bit seeking what your focus will be. Maybe not surprisingly, just like the previous project. At first, I thought anticipating crisis, how you were describing how maybe the state of crisis is not something like, let's say, critical or liminal, but really part of the human condition. So crisis is in a way a kind of normalcy. Then I thought, well, that might be something which you can conceptualize indeed by using a form of dialectics. However, the dialectical abstraction, as you describe it, is I'm not sure that this would yield this kind of inner tension and creating or jumping to another level of conceptualization. Since given the way that you described the dialectical abstraction, so maybe I didn't get that correctly, but coming from a Hegelian perspective, for instance, in my philosophy past, I didn't really recognize that. But then what I found interesting is how in the last contributions, using the framework, for instance, of trauma and memory, this could bring in really a new perspective on how crisis is part of the human condition. So maybe let me ask a question. I didn't really discover a concrete research question in your project, whether you can formulate it such that the anticipation of futures also relies on how we are dealing with our traumatic past, how the two are really interrelated, and how that would allow you to bring something new to this field of anticipating futures, which of course is something that we are all in a way trying to do right now.
Hi, Michael. Yesterday, hi. So yesterday we gave the conceptual framework of the whole thing, and today we just wanted to address the questions which came from the panel yesterday. Okay, so therefore you had no chance to see the conceptual structure. What was Sieves talk about as the dialectical method, the same thing can be formalized in the language of dynamic theory. Okay, so our point is, the main point is that we are in a crisis, which is the crisis, a crisis, which has many component crises, which are just studied one by one by dynamical system approaches, okay? And the relation of these and the structure of the whole is not addressed enough. And my point was that, for instance, I don't know whether have you seen the white paper of the Nobel Summit of this year, which was published in Embio about the future of Anthropocene or something, that was the title. And studying this paper, it turns out that there is a lot of wishful thinking about what should be done, and we don't understand why these things are not happening, at least at this naive level of scientists who produce that, okay, this has to be done. Don't you see it? Why don't you do it? And then people on the street and so on. Because the power structure is just missing. And somehow ecology and society are seen as two interacting things, but modeling and conceptualizing, first conceptualizing, because this is the first. And then comes a lot of models, not just one, but model families, okay? What is the relation of them, okay? So we think that this is missing, and from the PDS you also took part. We started then talk with Siaves about the dialectic method, and leading biologists also apply the dialectic methods for ecological problems, how to connect different model families, different levels on different time scales, spatial scales, and so on to each other. And I have the feeling that we can, applying the dialectical methods systematically, we can get a better view of the structure of problems, okay? And of the total system in a way. Okay.
Thanks for clarifying.
Other questions, this team?
Yeah, I think it would be helpful if Peter also added what the scholars doing there.
Yes, of course.
The question was what the film scholar is doing there for people online who wants to.
All right. And hi, Michael. Again, we started yesterday with this premise that the crisis is so acute that it has become impossible for us even to conceptualize or to envision the crisis itself. Okay. And what we are trying to address here is a problem of representation, how to conceptualize and envision the crisis itself, and how to possibly think or make room for the future. That's why anticipating. Now, I am a film scholar. What I'm interested here is in particular what ways we have to visualize such phenomena as the Anthropocene, for instance. And yesterday we have seen an excerpt from a 6-channel installation by Jonah Confra called Purple. And it is my belief that in that installation, what you can see, you can see some recordings of that on YouTube if you have a look at it. My contention here is that we can envision those 3 moments that pertain to the dialectical method that Siavesh was outlining here for us. So extension, generality, and point of view or vantage point through the kind of through the way in which this installation is constructed. It is about the Anthropocene itself. It is a 6-screen installation. So I'm sorry if we didn't have the time to go through everything again, because we wanted to take the time to see what really distinguishes our project, because this was a point that was raised yesterday, and we wanted to see how we can expand our collaborations. So I'm pretty sure that that the recording of yesterday's session will be soon available, and we would be happy to continue the conversation.
Yes, Andrei has a question.
Yeah, Peter, but I mean, so what is your role? And then now I have this question, not for Michael, it's just for everybody, I think. So, all right, so your work in this project is to find someone's films or installations or whatever visual art that somehow does what the team wants to do in visual means. And you are just this kind of ethnographer of contemporary visual presentations, finding good or kind of, visual presentations would do the right presentation from the point of view of this project.
So you see, the premise is that there is a crisis in representation. Now, representation both in its conceptual level and in terms of imaginaries. And in this sense, my contention here is that the visual arts can contribute a lot in developing our imaginaries about possible futures, about the crisis itself. So this is how I see my role here, because what we are trying to do is to conceptualize, model, and visualize, or to address these three questions that we see as interrelated.
Okay.
Perhaps it helps if you give the titles what we were thinking about, what could be the first publications that we start to work on. And
no, because we didn't have the time. So yes, of course. I mean, as you might remember from yesterday, we decided to start our collaboration by looking at a very concrete thing, which was this installation that you could see yesterday in our presentation. And we decided that that might be the best point to start because it is a discrete object and at the same time it is something very concrete. And we have been asked about a tentative title which we thought about, and for instance the title that we have in mind, of course it is a working title, it's Planetary Crisis, and the subtitle is Dialectical Representations of the Anthropocene in Jonah Confra's Purple. So I see how the expertise of my colleagues is converging onto the work that I'm interested in pursuing, and I see the kind of expertise that I can bring to the project itself.
Okay, other questions?
I pasted a question in the chat.
Yes, Michael, but I don't think it's a good idea. I mean, people in the room cannot see it, so if you could spell it out via voice, that would be
right. That's why
more helpful. Okay.
Yeah. So I'm reading my own comment then. So, of course, visual arts have always contributed to our anticipating new futures since ancient times. However, I'm asking if we are looking at a drastic change of the system in a critical phase, will the arts as we know them suffice? Shouldn't we look critically at the existing modes of arts, including current like installation arts or eco art, etc., assuming that they're equally tainted by traditional approaches, perhaps just like many of our science projects are not up to the task of addressing new forms of crisis?
Yes, thank you for the question. And this is precisely the point. The kind of example that we came up with is an example that is challenging usual forms of representation. It is challenging the cognitive capacity of the viewer, because what you have there is a 6-screen installation. You cannot master the visual field. You cannot see what's going on. And at the same time, you see that kind of discrete and self-enclosed world, which is usually understood to be the cinematic screen, is broken down in 6 different and however interrelated components. Now, this is an attempt at forcing us to imagine the ways in which we can conceive of phenomena such as the Anthropocene or the interrelation of all those crises that usually are treated as separate events, separate facts, in a holistic way and within a dynamic system. Does this make sense? So we are looking for ways that might allow us to imagine and therefore to understand. And we are trying to bring together the conceptual level as well as our capacity to imagine. And that's also a reason why we would like to also include the literary scholar who is working on science fiction, because we believe that that might enrich this dialogue between biology, philosophy, and the visual arts.
Well, very briefly, it sounds interesting, so I would be interested in learning more about the work. But as soon as it sticks to a form of representation, I'm asking myself whether that is up to the task that I would have in mind, whether maybe a work of art can really stir, encourage, or even like force new modes of interaction with between humans and also with reality.
Well, if the question is, if you allow me to rephrase it in very simple terms as, will this change the world? I don't know, but it might allow us to think in different ways. It might allow us to imagine things that seem beyond the imagination. How can you visualize the Anthropocene? How can you visualize something as like climate change? This cannot be visualized. You cannot simply look at a local phenomenon and take that as the representative of a larger phenomenon. You can also not visualize the totality of this phenomenon. So we are forced by certain works to develop the imaginative skills that might allow us at least to conceive of this crisis not as the kind of problem with which governmental, especially non-governmental institutions are trying to address the crisis. The latest example, of course, is the summit in Glasgow, right? What was achieved there? You see, the claim here is that we have lost the capability of envisioning the crisis itself. And so the answer to will these visual works change our relationship with the world? I don't know. I don't think so. I don't think this is really... But what we are interested in is to see if they can help us think and imagine.
Okay, and we have one more question from Louis. Short question and short answer.
Don't you have the impression that the common or the real problem here is, the real problem of why all these crises live next to each other without coming to real solution is political, and that okay, there is a power structure, politicians don't want to take too unpopular decisions, and should you not focus on that problem, namely how to change the political decision making? Is political decision making not the real common denominator, and would the greatest benefit of the project reside in that extremely difficult problem for academics to deal with?
This is exactly the reified way of looking at the matter. You know, like, again, you're pushing yourself to the fixed point. You know, like, it's about political decision making. It's not about that. As a matter of fact,
that's not reified. That's a process.
This way of you know, like, making politics itself is another, you know, vantage point from which you can look at the problem. You see, like, it is not, we are not talking about a simple causal bond, that there are a bunch of bad people sitting there and, you know, like, they're making bad decisions for the, you know, like, sake of corporations or something like that. This is not. I mean, I think even that the severeness of the problem is not being understood. That's our main, that's something that we have, you know, like, in mind as well.
Louis, you could also ask why not we look at the economical problems, because behind the politicians' decision making is not just correction and selfish self-interest, but economical laws as well, if I understand well. So it is again another crisis and another slide. And what we want to see that how these are interrelated, if possible. Okay, and we would like to state that this type of vantage point that we have, actually, it is necessary to step forward because of the crisis of representation of the crisis itself.
Mm-hmm. Okay. But then could you give a beginning of a hint of how your model building comparison could lead to some insights, to some conclusion? Because you're basing your methodology is comparing models and applying a generalizing methodology that Chavez described at the beginning.
Looking at assumptions which are made when a certain sector is modeled and pictured, and how these assumptions are related to each other, and how it is And then that's the first step, just to look at that. And then I don't know how it will develop further from this point of view. But please don't ask to solve a problem with a lot of people try to solve in a way and in one step.
First hint of a direction.
Okay. The purpose of a good discussion is to not be done. So I suggest that we break here. We continue over the coffee and we get back in 15 minutes, so 17:40 Tumen time for the next two research projects. Thank you to this team.
We are not streamed, right? Mazen, hi, it's Giacomo.
Hi, hello, Giacomo.
Hey, so you will use your slides, right? I mean, you can share them directly from your computer.
Okay, no problem.
Okay, I think we're starting. Yeah, if you can try, because right now we're not streamed,
Yeah.
so. Just to double check.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's trying.
Can you see?
Yeah, I think you can make them full screen. Great, yeah, we can see them. Okay.
Okay. Shall we? Media production, last part. That's what I'm saying, that we are ready to go online. So now we have the free will team with the 3 existing members, 1 new member. Giacomo will be presenting, no, Mazen will be presenting from over online. So Mazen, you have up to, please, if you could stop, thank you. Thank you.
10 minutes, huh?
Okay. Yes.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Thank you so much, and good evening, everybody. Actually, I have to bring up 2 things before I start. First of all, my internet connection is slow, so I apologize in advance if I ask somebody to repeat the question, because sometimes the voice would be freezing, and I guess it's not be easy to come to Damascus from Rome with 15 hours of break, but that's a free will, and the consequences is now ending up actually apologizing in advance for that thing. The second thing I would like to mention here is that I want to thank the team members, Giacomo, Louis, and Alexander, for their insightful and very, very fruitful collaboration and the flexibility that they share with me and trusting me to give this presentation. Now, on the subject at hand, free will, something that I think everybody knows, whether it's a professor with an H index of 500 or a school teenager. We have a wide range of people that know and are aware of free will and determinism, if I may say, because it's the the opposite subject at that matter. But the thing is that, and I was included in this wide range, that a few group or a minority of that wide range of people who has knowledge of free will knows how the subject of free will relates to the consequences or the results in believing or disbelieving in that subject. And after an investigations over this subject, why I became interested that we found out that, for my sake, that many scientists in the two past decades have become increasingly vocal about their skepticism concerning free will and responsibility. And one of the themes in this debate actually is the recent scientific advances when it comes to philosophy and psychology, which may threaten our traditional picture of agency and responsibility. So the potential ramification of the expanding profile of free will skepticism is that it may negatively affect moral behavior. Before I start talking about this slide, I just want the audience to understand that since I'm an economist, I'm always interested in the causality. And when I talk here, we're talking about two variables. Variable A, whether it's free will, anti-free will, free will skepticism, determinism, you mentioned it. I mean, it's different from different points of view. And the second variable, the B variable, which is the consequences of manipulating within the variable A. So here I come to the applications of manipulating or sending messages to free will. Has been actually widely cited and investigated in the past 10 years. And we can see from this slide that how the manipulation of free will, or let's say anti-free will messages, would lead to lower levels of autonomy and proactivity, or less self-efficacy and more perceived helplessness, or lower academic performance, or deteriorated feelings of belonging, self-control, and meaningfulness. So as you can see, the consequences, the literature, the scholars were really interested in the consequences of manipulating with this variable A. And one particular aspect of this application actually of manipulating free will was to undermine moral behavior, particularly the case of cheating. This was actually investigated and depicted in the seminal work of Voss and Schuler in 2008. A very well-known paper, which has over 1,000 citations, and all the works that you've seen previously were built up on the ideas or the model that Voss and Schuler actually shown in their paper. So we became intrigued by one of the consequences of anti-free will messages that have been investigated recently in the literature, which is uncooperative behavior. So we have anti-free will messages, and the consequences is uncooperative behavior. And this was investigated by Protzok et al. 2016 paper, which is actually was in the Journal of Cognition, as you can see in the slide. So how does it work? Those guys actually, as you can see, say, or they believe, or they started from the point that anti-free will messages actually would lead to uncooperative behavior. But between them, we don't know how this endorsing a disbelief business in free will could operate. So here it comes again, the causality, the operation between the two variables, how one would affect the other and what level. And the most interesting part of this paper is that those guys, Protzok et al., has built up on the work of the Princeton University psychologist, Daniel Kahneman, who was awarded the Nobel in Economic Sciences for his groundbreaking work in applying psychological insights into economic theory, particularly in the areas of judgment and decision-making. So he's basically bridging economics and psychology. And the reason for this was his that he found out how the behavior and decision-making engage, and basically what he found out that it engaged two mental processes. One process is intuitive and relies on heuristic information, which is quicker and more prone to error. That's intuition. And the second process is slower, more deliberate, and avoids certain biases. So at this process, people would take some time to think and respond in action. So those guys, the Predictive et al., in their paper, actually, were thinking about the impact of anti-free will messages on uncooperative behavior, whether it works on an intuitive processing or a deliberative processing, because now we have two channels. We never know how one thing would lead to another unless we're certain about the channels that this thing or phenomena works. So the objectives of the paper of Predictive et al. Was to assess the impact of anti-free will messages on intuitive versus, of course, deliberative processing by using speeded and delayed choice versions of the public goods game and a design of experimental economics after removing or discounting the existence of free will. So basically what happens, or what are the premise of the paper? Endorsing a disbelief in free will by providing free will, anti-free will messages, affecting uncooperative behavior through the channel of deliberative processing of self-exoneration would have an impact on decisions under conditions in which participants have time to consider the process of exonerating implications of a lack of free will. So those guys actually hypothesized that through this deliberative process, the slow channel, people, the anti-free will would be sensitive more to times when they are more loose and people would have the opportunity to think. But the other channel would work, I guess, on the opposite direction, where we have the impact on decisions under conditions which participants are required to make cooperative decisions under time pressure. Now, here we step in, our team, to work on some improvements and suggestions that would work on the methodologies that was actually implied or implemented by Predictive. So we believe that the flows is that Predictive conduct a public good game in a non-standard way because their test was not dynamic. The pot game was done only for one round, only one shot. So our refinement in that perspective would consist in replicating the test, but in a dynamic way, which makes it more standard and more reliable. And the second improvement that when we're running our test in Predictive et al. Style, we can refine the no free will text that presented to the subjects within the experiments. For instance, we suspect that in the literature about these tests, the no free will thesis will be presented in a very simplistic way as a total absence of free will. So here comes Louis and Giacomo can contribute to that by preparing text for the subjects that present more nuanced position on free will by hard determinism or compatibilism and libertarianism where people have absolute free will. So as you can see, our paper is mainly methodological, and we expect that our research would be submitted to either the Journal of Cognition or the Journal of Experimental Economics or the Journal of Economic Psychology. And the last slide I'm gonna end up with that we had some ideas for a further or a future research that would be followed up by this recent research, that we need to include two dimensions that I think would be productive in that matter, which are the religion and geography. Because if you're moving from one part to another part of the world, people's perception of free will or determinism would change. And we had this idea of including or expanding or designing new experiments that would include that dimension. And also the geography matter would also be very important in this process, because also if you're moving to one country or to another, the perspective of geography, which is a proxy of accumulation of the culture, would matter also in that matter. So our actually 4 suggested topics for future research, that how sensitive is the uncooperative behavior, which is endorsed on a deliberative level to the context of religion, and also how sensitive is the uncooperative behavior, which is endorsed on a deliberative level that to context of geography. And the second themes also would be to the sensitivity of the uncooperative behavior endorsed on an intuitive level to the context of religion as well, and geography. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mazen. And who has the first question to this team? Alexander, then Andrew, then Andre.
Yeah, thank you very much for this presentation. So basically, I have, like always, several questions, but all these questions are approximately around one topic. So as far as I can see from your profile in the internet, you are financial economists, you're a scholar which is using secondary data to apply different econometric models and then obtain some results. And the design which is described here in this in your report is basically purely experimental design. So do I get it right, first of all, that you are like expanding your own limits and you've created and designed it or proposed this new design and this new experiment to the group? And my second question is, do I get it right that, not do I get it right, but how you think the line of research of this group fits to your line of research, to questions which are eternal to you, because I believe that every researcher do have his own eternal question to which he returns different ways. So for me, for example, that's the concept of rationality. So how that fits with your own line research, and what will be new in that field line of research after, for example, 2 or 3 years when this project will come to some deliverables. Yeah. So the actual 3 questions. First, do I get it right that this is your experiment? How it fits your previous background, and what will change in your future research action after this experiment, after this research?
Thank you, Alexander, for always asking insightful questions. The answer to the first question, it's not my expertise to design experimental, because I work mostly on econometric analysis and microeconometric analysis. But I was always concerned of expanding my profile into experimental economics. But the thing is that from within this project, the theme that I'm really interested in the causality between the variables, as I said, and to build up more expertise in designing the experiments, and to actually have more in-depth analysis within the process of the research to build up that point or that domain that I just only read about, or to kind of still in my infant phase regarding that matter. The second question is that how it fits with my research. Basically, when you're dealing, whether it's econometric analysis or experimental economics, we always have this inference that we should build up on. And that also would give me a new dimension when you, the inference that we would make in connecting the 2 variables throughout the channels. But as you can notice that the paper from my perspective is much more mythological than others would say, because we're dealing with some flows in the design itself. So for my sake, my part within the team would build up on more the inference, the causality, the econometric analysis, even from designing an experiment, because you're dealing with results, you're dealing with the one-shot BS iterated or multi rounds of PGG, and that's exactly what I look for into expanding my profile. I'm sorry if there's a third question I don't remember. I don't know if that answers your questions.
The third question, if I remember correctly, was how the research done here will influence what your further research.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. Moving from any domain to another would require a learning process, would require to be have more experienced and to work with others to gain this experience and knowledge. For my sake, moving from the financial economics, banking, to the development economics and labor economics would be a process that I need to learn actually how to be able to design these games and to engage more on the social dilemma and the free rider problems, all sort of things that allure me as an economist, which I have a great passion to. But I've never experienced that in my publications or just an understanding or reading of the subject. So in 2 or 3 years, I'm looking and focusing on to become expert in that domain and to use it as an input and going to the development economics and labor economics as well.
Okay, now we are asking for shorter questions, and I'm sorry because I haven't seen Carlos was having a hand first. So Carlos, please.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you for your presentation. This is a research project that I've been very interested in from the very beginning, but I haven't participated so far because I couldn't see how me and other people whose research is primarily concerned with the humanities would fit into that project. And the first day in the presentations, you gestured towards the inclusion of people who were working on critical theory, literary studies, cultural studies, etc. However, I feel as if you didn't provide the means by which those various scholars could make a contribution. So you were saying, yes, you're welcome. Yes, please come to the group. But at the same time, I didn't see any articulation on how that would be an addition to the group, an organic addition to the group, as opposed to forced interdisciplinarity or we add you because we have to know, because we actually think is going to benefit the research. And today is the first time that I've seen specific research questions involving fields that belong to the humanities, religion, geography, etc. So my question is, do you see these reach towards other fields in the humanities, religion, geography as something organic to the project? Or are you doing this because you feel that you have to, but you fear that it might be counterproductive? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carlos. Would you like to answer, Louis? Or?
Yes, well, I can start. Let us not forget that everything started with the humanities and classic philosophical research on a classic philosophical question. So that's one answer. The second is that we have heard Sky, presenting really a typical humanities project, which is, I would say, intimately related to the topic. And it's difficult to say what is the egg and the chicken, who comes first, and how, what's the dynamic of the research, what can influence the other in the most decisive way, which new questions can come out. We had a slide with a few questions or a few suggestions for other research projects, for instance, the history of the determinism versus indeterminism debate, or how I think that could be studied in Mazen's project, namely the different cultural evaluation of determinism and free will. So how different cultures deal with that, which I think that our experiment is a pragmatical, simple introduction to, because Mazen will yes, indeed, in the beginning work closely with us, or would work closely with us, and we would give a lot of input, but his specific experience with different cultures will at some point hopefully become very interesting, and will, if we do a good job, or could lead to interesting insights over these cultural questions. So I think that everyone has understood that our main strategy was to come up with a realistic and pretty focused thing in the beginning.
Andrew.
Okay, yeah, I mean, this is like, I feel a little bit whiplashed based on the difference between the first day and today. So, and the way I would put it is like, the first day you guys were interested in eternal philosophical questions. Now you guys are, it's like using your great philosophers to shoot mosquitoes with a bazooka. I mean, basically, this is a very nice empirical, I mean, experimental economics. I think it's great. But it seems to me your expertise is essentially so sort of 99% of what you normally think about is totally irrelevant to this project.
Well,
that's true?
Martel, this is an additional line of research.
Okay, so you would continue to do the things that you're doing already.
Yes,
I just don't say,
course,
I mean, you know, because it doesn't seem like it really matters to start with. I mean, normally I think you care whether there is such a thing as free will or there isn't. In this project, it's totally irrelevant whether there is such a thing or there isn't. It's a question of what people are made to think, right, or encouraged to think. And then maybe historically and geographically where they think it or where they don't think it. It's not related, it doesn't seem related in any way to sort of quotes real philosophy.
Yeah, I think we agree. Actually, yes, we see this as an addition to what we're already doing, and we want to keep doing what we're already doing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Michael.
Well, many thanks. So again, of course, I'm new to the discussion of this project. So as far as I understand, it's really about Mazen's contribution to an existing project. Of course, I've heard and talked to Louis on an earlier occasion. So let me very briefly mention, so these dual system approaches or dual process approaches, they've been around for decades. I've myself written also about that, on how they influence our decision-making, etc. So I'm wondering whether that would really bring something new to the field, even though I like the specificity of the project. So my suggestion is that a much newer, much more recent contender on the field, like equally or even more comprehensive in its explanatory claims in cognitive neuroscience, or even beyond cognitive neuroscience, is a so-called predictive processing theory, which very in just one sentence puts gives an account how our brain is constantly predicting future percepts or future inputs, and then comparing that with internal models. And the only thing that the brain then has to do is compare and consider how much surprise does reality present to us based upon our priors, as it is called. And what might be interesting for an economist like yourself is that this was really inspired by a physicist, Carl Friston, turned cognitive scientist, who is interested in the amount of free energy that the system can absorb and also has to reduce in a way. So if you would do that, and then I could think that, for instance, the generative model that we are using as a kind of prior anticipating new inputs, these models could be described as by Louis and others like following compatibilism, soft and hard determinism. And then you could test that indeed in the kind of responses that subjects would give, and then integrating these research, these findings into this much more up-to-date, much more detailed account of predictive processing. I think that really could be present an innovative contribution to the fields.
Great, thank you so much. Absolutely, thank you so much.
Andre.
Yeah, I have a question to Mazen, the following one, right? So can you, as far as I understand, the experiments you're describing is that a person who is being experimented upon reads a text where it says that there is no free will, and after that they play a game and you see how they act, and then alternatively they read the text where it says that there is free will, and then you compare that, right? So in a similar way, you can just ask a person to read a text which says that God doesn't exist, and then study how atheists behave, and then you give the same person to read a text where it says God does exist, and then see how religious people behave. So if I understand the methodology right, then I'm asking Mazen to reflect on it and say why it can make no sense to anybody who studies religion, people convictions, behavior from a more kind of humanities, social science point of view.
Okay, thank you, Andre. Well, you put it actually, from what I understand in this, a very simple way. People would differ actually, and when I brought in the elements of religion and geography later on, I was really intrigued to question that by designing the models. But from my involvement, my part of the research, the group team, that is that we have to sort of know what exactly, how the anti-free will messages, how it will fluctuate within the environment that those people actually are experienced. So that's the mythology, or the point that I'm really trying to catch, is that there's some functionality. It's not white or black. There's a gray area. There's some shades there between the two extremes. And we're trying in this paper actually to understand in more experiments in designing anything that has nothing to do with the flows of the paper, is that how people would relate to these messages. But from your question on the reflection, whether the person is a theist or not, I can tell you about myself personally, because when I started reading about the free will, the anti-free will, I am actually a believer in free will. I am Muslim, and it's not just I don't like to bring up religion or politics for that matter, but I was really interested in doing a test to myself to see whether an experiment is done by myself, and I have a pre-contentions about what's going on. So I did the FAD plus, knowing that because in experimental economics, when the subject's exposed to experiments and they have a pre-knowledge of what's going on, that might affect them. But those guys who actually did the FAD, designed in a way that I was myself actually, I was lost in the experiment. And the final actually result was that I am a pro free will. So it turns out that when you're moving from one point to another, it's different. I lived in Sweden. In Sweden, people are not religious. You don't see that many churches. Whereas I was talking to Giacomo in Rome, it's there in every street. So this is actually a matter of the functionality of the society, the belief in religion. I'm not trying to claim that I'm an expert on that matter, Andre, but what I'm really interested in is that to expose the causality, the inference that we're dealing with when we're dealing with this experimental design.
Okay, so I'm sorry, just to clarify. So what is the causality between? So it's a causality not between someone believing in free will or not believing, because you're not claiming that you change a person's beliefs by giving them to read the text. It's about it's a consequence between having read the message and doing something, and having read a different message and then again doing something. And can we imagine that somebody who reads an anti-free will message actually becomes more convinced that free will does exist?
It's not that, as you put it, actually, people have to have some sort of predetermined or belief in something, but these messages would play in changing, exposing people's views of that matter, and how that would lead to something. As I mentioned, Andre, in the first part of my introduction, that we have two variables. We have the variable that we're dealing with it's free will or anti-free will, and the consequences. The part is that just exposing people to messages will differentiate or will actually will alter their views. It's not that easy, or it's not that simple, because the literature actually was focusing on how those people are exposed to some conditions, some experiments, some conditions, and what are the consequences of that. And in the second slide, I showed that subject was related to immoral behavior like cheating or some reduced self-control. It's different aspects, whether we are discussing or not. So I think that what you mentioned is really important, but I'm not that expert on answering that, whether we just somebody exposed to a message will alter his view or not. That I cannot answer because I'm new to the subject.
Yeah, thank you.
Do we have any other questions to Mazen? Olga.
Just a question for all members of the team. Could you please elaborate a little bit about practical application of your research? Who could be potential buyers of that? Well, I'm actually thinking about authoritarian governments, but maybe you have other suggestions.
I don't know, we like to think that we kind of do fundamental research and maybe sometimes it's not always practical, but in the case of these tests, I don't know, these experiments, they can actually illuminate how people behave, so I think there can be practical applications, maybe.
Can I answer, Giacomo?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Yeah, I'm sorry. In economics, actually, we're dealing with policymakers. In this case, we don't have a policymaker. So our buyers would be actually the scholars actually working on that subject. How this phenomena is resolved, because we still have a debate. So the practicality of that is that we're just shedding some lights on the ongoing debate on or the behavior or the experiments that have been done actually recently, so that other scholars, I think, and I guess that other scholars would enrich their literature in investigating that matter. But from my point of view, there are no policymakers involved. The governments would not buy the research actually to enlighten the societies, whether to go from one society to another. Because obviously, I myself, 7 days ago, had no idea about this. I mean, I'm just confessing that. I don't have any idea about that. So for my sake, I would like really to get involved and to shed some light on that matter for others actually to work on this perspective.
So I'd like to add, so probably truth is somewhere in the middle as usual, in a gray zone, but I will provide kind of black and white extremes. So one extreme is, as Giacomo said, so there is definitely some demand on psychology and philosophy level on this kind of effect on free will on decision making that we've seen in papers that Mazen found and citations. So that's kind of one purely scholarly extreme. The other extreme is, let's say it's maybe it's too wild, that's why it's an extreme, but let's say we consider schooling, right? So in schools, is it good to tell children about free will and determinism in very maybe basic things, but is it useful, is it good for their decision making in the future? I don't have this answer, but maybe this answer is useful for policy making in this kind of primary education.
If I may add some more speculative line of research that still might be useful for some users, I think personally that understanding how people think and how they use models and representations is extremely important to understand. For instance, for enhancing artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is not advancing very fast because it does not master theoretical or model-based thinking. And these experiments might help to see to make progress here. I admit that's a futuristic line of research, but I think it's worth you trying to see whether this can lead to this potential benefit.
Michael, you have the last question.
Well, thanks. And in a way, Louis' last remark I can connect to, because I also thought on another topic that Kahneman and Tversky really brought to public attention is the nudging, where we can use the kind of automatic processing that the system one drives many of our cognition and behavior. And indeed in AI systems, similarly, we are implementing the kinds of reasoning that people are doing. And I think, for instance, in automatic or autonomous vehicles like the Tesla car, etc. And the question is, can we personalize this? Can we make the Tesla car develop the kind of decisions that fit with a specific profile, for instance, the moral profile of the driver? For instance, does the driver run into a young child crossing a zebra instead of maybe driving himself into a wall? Or would the driver rather prefer to drive himself into a wall? And I think getting a better grip on how, in an individual case, these implicit and explicit processes work might indeed help to implement those in the kind of AI systems that we are increasingly using in assisting our decision making.
Yeah, thanks, Michael, and hi, by the way. Yeah, it's interesting because actually this was part of our presentation yesterday. We actually have, at this stage, is one of the the preliminary line of research that we are thinking about. We are actually thinking about how we can implement ethical systems in like consequentialism or utilitarianism or other systems into artificial intelligence systems. And yeah, at this point we were discussing how we could use the formalism of the ontic logic to try to formalize these ethical systems and feed them into artificial intelligence systems. Maybe Louis wants to add.
No. But it would be very nice to have a cognitive scientist working with us, Michael. So by this, you're warmly invited to join the debate.
Okay, and on that note, we thank the Free Will team, and we move to the last team. So the VR empathy machines. I believe we need more chairs. How many chairs do you need? How many old school offline human beings? 2 more chairs we need here. And who will be presenting out of you? Yeah, sure.
Yeah, before we start, I just wanted to say how we're going to be presenting depends a little bit on the fact that Sang-Yeon already presented on the first day, and so Carlos presented yesterday, so we wanted to give an opportunity for the rest of us to present. And also wanted to let you know for the new panel member that this was originally a topic that Sang-Yeon worked on and invited us to join the team. So just to give you a bit of background, I think, sorry, give me a moment. Great. Okay, so this is the title. We have a new team member, Dwayne. And we were also really grateful for all the feedback we got yesterday, and it helped us kind of rework a couple of ideas on the project. So we felt that one of the first things that we wanted to work on was to kind of clarify and refocus some of our disciplines and what we're going to be bringing to the project. So you can see that here. So we eliminated a couple of things. We felt they were unnecessary. We felt they were covered also by other people, and they were really, some of the things weren't really our own best expertise, let's say. So this is how it looks now. We have the addition of Dwayne, clinical psychoanalysis and game studies, which I feel like quite clearly, obviously is like a benefit to the project in many ways. So I don't think I really need to comment on that. And we also felt there was still some kind of lacking in the project, and not a lacking, but the project would also benefit from some of our current networks, and we wanted to kind of showcase that as well, because we felt it was great to create new networks. And some of the people that we're hoping, obviously these are potentials, we haven't actually contacted these people yet, so please have that in mind, people on YouTube. Some of the potential, let's say, is Avril Furness, who's a VR film specialist. Then we have Janneke van Leuven, who's a neuropsychologist, also a specialist in VTC, visual thinking strategies. as well as Denis Peszczynski, who is doing long-term research on PTSD, 9/11, and Bataclan. You can read the rest. I was like trying to make sure we're on time. So we decided to drop, because of some of the comments yesterday, we decided to drop the idea of NFTs and blockchain. So we felt obviously we don't have the expertise. It became quite evident yesterday, so we felt it was ridiculous to continue in that direction. Next, we've also felt that in terms of feasibility of the project, it would be, and also financial feasibility, the idea of like a redevelopment or actual new development of technology might be a bit too far of a step for a 1 to 3 year project. And we dropped questions 2 and 3 as well. What we did add was the idea of faculty collaboration, the potential collaboration of students, particularly students from the MA in experimental education, and the idea that we were actually going to buy IVR. IVR is immersive virtual reality technology to be acquired directly from the developers, rather than us working with the developer to create something new. And yeah, we also worked on an action plan. So next, these were the original 4 questions, and this is what we're left with. So the first research question, a hypothesis, we're going to kind of work on 2 different aspects. The more central focus is going to be the first one, the audience, and kind of looking at empathic responses. And the second one will be from the perspective of looking at the aspect of healing using technology in respect comparison to the idea of other forms like film, art, and game. The research plan is going to be in 2 stages. The first stage will be literature review, which is something that Dwayne and Carlos and Sangyang are going to be working on more. And in the second stage, be more of collaboration between myself, Xenia, and Alexander. This is going to be the focus and kind of like the brief overview of what the literature review will focus on, the kind of time period we're looking at, which is a time period that very much relates to how the technology developed itself, and then the kind of databases where we're going to be collecting the articles from. This is some of the criteria for our literature review. So looking at population samples, higher education, looking at whether there are neurological developmental conditions and used as a rehabilitation tool, looking at the difference between control groups in terms of the uses of HDMs, and finally kind of looking at outcomes and how outcomes are assessed. And this is an example of something what our literature review might look like. You can see the different kind of categories, the findings, the learning domain, the kind of technology that's being used, and the kind of comparison variables. The second stage will include a more like experimental part, and that's where we're going to be doing our focus groups as well. So I'm going to just skip really quickly to what the first one is. Like, we realized that actually buying technology is very affordable now. So we found a headset that we felt also, based on some of our like very brief research, was one that was most often used compared to others. I'll just skip back really quickly. And in second part, we're going to use two different groups of participants. Ones there will be using VR, the other ones won't, and will instead be using more traditional forms such as art and game. And we're going to be testing for, as we mentioned before, affective skills, empathic responses, and then we're going to replicate the experiment off campus as well. So the first experiment will take place with the students, will be used somehow in a sense of like a pilot experiment. The second part will take place off campus, and then we're going to compare and contrast the results. And I'm going to pass it on to Alexander.
So I'll just be showing a couple of the examples that are drawn from the research of several of the group members, and you can see those there. But I will go in just a small bit of depth into the example that's drawn from my research, writing, and teaching films and books that I've taught several times to students about the 1937 Nanjing massacre. And the idea here is that there is numerous representations of this traumatic historical event, and they bear heavily upon political discourse as well as kind of public perception of that event, and that the experiences of this film and fiction do that, and then can even shift kind of public sentiment very drastically. So the idea being here that if we're going to develop an immersive VR experience from out of the historical details of that event, this would be a way to test our hypothesis. And then personally, I'm interested, as I know several of the group members are interested, in comparing or putting those results into conversation with the experience of films and literature on the same event. And sorry, this one. And then these are some of the other examples that are drawn from the research of other group members. And in the experiment design and implementation phase, we're going to draw on some of our networks as researchers and personal connections with colleagues. So you can see a few of these here: the UCR, the Riverside Brain Game Center, Game Change at the Royal College of Art, Bay Ridge Counseling Center, which Dwayne has close connections to, and a few others, including a colleague of mine at Georgia Tech, Janet Murray, who has written the book on designing immersive VR experiences. And oh shoot, sorry, can you show me? No, that's okay. Yeah, and I'll pass it off to Ksenia to conclude.
Yeah, all right, thank you. So the second research question and the hypothesis deals with the question that we discussed yesterday, is the ethical concern and sort of having solid ethical research conduct standards, and that has direct relevance to to public policy. So what we want to explore is how this new technology would is requiring new research ethic guidelines. I mentioned some of the public policies yesterday, and kind of made me think even further. That really, we have this question of democracy, and as we know, democracy comes as a direct or representative, and then now it's been evolved that we have 4 types of democracies: monetary, representative, constitutional, direct. But there's also another, sort of say, darling of the democracy studies is the deliberative democracy, and it's been used both, for the very sort of theoretical, conceptual discussions, but also trying to embrace many empirical cases. And this is really, really top. There's definitely OECD, they had a special workshop and a special white paper produced on virtual reality and deliberative democracy. And this is here I also put some literature where we could feed in, looking at the how to manage a virtual reality, and really, it fits both. So we can have some theoretical contributions, and it could be also something practical, because it's also kind of having the right expectation. It's not to. I think we don't have a lawyer, as we discussed yesterday. So what I think would be great is to use our experience to to provide some of the suggestions that could be used further, for example, by OECD in the further development of the standards for the ethical concern. And this is really as we know, this is quite evolving, and I think this would really have both the scientific contribution and the practical contribution in terms of policy making. So we discussed yesterday, it can have different topics. So this is just something that we think might come up. Obviously, we'll carry on developing it. So thanks very much.
Thank you. Now, who would like to start? Machiel.
Thanks for again an interesting presentation. It reminds me of a project that was part of our conference on wielding the brain. So we had a research group on neuroaesthetics and neurocultures here, where the artist Maarten Navian, a Dutch filmmaker, helped children who are suffering from epilepsy and the absences in epilepsy. These children, together with artists, developed a VR environment where they would display the kind of often really traumatizing images of falling into a cliff or being haunted by animals, etc. And then through these IVR machines, their caregivers, for instance, their parents, could really immerse themselves in the kind of super anxious experiences that these children would have. So I think that's the kind of demonstration of an empathy machine that I would have in mind. However, I can see that in your presentation, it seems you're more interested in using this technology to influence or enhance or expand citizen deliberation, which I think would raise, before raising all kinds of ethical questions, really would raise a question like who is going to design the IVR environments? What kind of scenarios will be involved? How will the experiences there being used in the deliberation? There are, of course, many normative issues involved in creating environments like this. So where is the autonomy of the viewer, of the person immersed in that experience? To what extent is the creation of this new environment transparent, so we can make decisions about it? So I can see a lot of interesting questions raising here, but as of now, I feel, but again, I've seen only the last bit of your work, of course, it's still a little bit in two different trajectories, the empathy machine and the deliberation process. So I'm really interested where you want to go.
I don't see them conflicting. I think we, the intention is to, to go both.
Carlos.
Yes, I would like to add. Thank you for the question. I think it's really pertinent here. I would like to respond to that by alluding to the understanding of Chomsky about democracy. So, for Chomsky, for instance, democracy is not just voting every 4 years or whatever, but actually being able to exert that vote with a prior understanding of what you're voting about. And public deliberation is key for that matter. And so if you cannot debate on the issues on which you're going to vote, what is the relevance of a vote that doesn't come out of free will, precisely? And so the possibility of public deliberation presupposes an understanding of historical events and political notions that the use of virtual reality can contribute to, in the sense that what we're measuring with the use of immersive virtual reality are cognitive empathy and emotional empathy. So emotional empathy has to do with the ability to sense what other people are sensing physically, whereas cognitive empathy also involves understanding the reasons why these feelings occur and what are their consequences, which again contributes to the possibility of explaining historical facts and concepts, and therefore it increases public deliberation, which results in a more autonomous form of democracy and transparent form of democracy.
Thank you for a great comment. I'm not sure whether I understand your question correct, but correct me if I'm wrong. But the first part of the question or comment that you mentioned that the epilepsy in children and the VR. And I think the reason why the three humanities or media scholars, film scholars, and I'm like Asian studies, VR, new media studies scholars are needed in this project is because there are already a lot of VR films and VR art forms out there, and these great artistic products were not properly researched and used in this kind of interdisciplinary research. So what I'm interested in, I don't think that we really need to create an environment or the VR film, whatever, to do this experiment, because there are already great examples that I want to test out to see. So in our one of the slide, there is a first question research, and there was two hypothetical conclusions. So this is kind of one hypothetical conclusion is about patients. So with patients, for instance, we explained it yesterday. The patient of, let's say, 9/11, the traumatic patient of 9/11, let's say, or the subject, let's say. So with this VR film already made to address this specific event with, for instance, 9/11. Or there are many great examples of dealing with the traumatic event historically. So we can do that. And the second hypothesis, which is about audiences, how we can use these kind of VR medias and films and art forms to make bystanders or other audiences to have more empathy to certain group of people, for instance, racial minority, or in terms of like a male, the audiences to the female, or the so forth and so on. So I think in that sense, I think there are many examples that we want to test out and use for the
Andrew.
And sorry, can I add one more?
Sure.
So you and also I don't know what kind of institution you are working, but it sounds very interesting. But do you mind if I ask you, like, you said the epilepsy in children research? What was the?
I just mentioned that in the chat, so perhaps someone can link to the website about that as well.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Andrew.
Okay, so of the two things you just mentioned, the second one I can definitely see how you could do.
Yeah.
The first one here, at least in Tumen, you don't have any research subjects.
Mm.
How are you going to find out how people who went through 9/11 respond to VR stuff when they don't? Where are those people in Tumen? I've never met one. So you got. I mean, you can't say they're existing products that cover. I mean, or the Nanjing massacre. I mean, all right, please.
I also have. Yeah,
we discussed this at length and as part of the design of the potential experiments, and we think that actually, so you don't have to be a survivor of the Nanjing massacre to read Iris Chang's controversial book, and it generates kinds of empathy and it generates other conflicting feelings, and so the foreignness or the distance of the example actually works really well in the experiments. If you were, for instance, teaching, as many people do, these films and books, to students who are not from Nanjing, who are not from China, in Tumen, for instance, you are trying to understand their experience, and through their experience, they are learning and feeling.
Sure, that's number two again. That's the second.
Right,
it's not the first.
But you asked about how survivors might.
Well, no, the only traumatic experience you can do with our students is their education here. That might be a traumatic experience that you could.
But can they understand the experience?
Yeah, but that's back to number two. That's the second one again. Can they achieve empathy with some other thing that they didn't actually participate in? That definitely you can do that.
As I understand it, and I admit I'm kind of new to the project, but I feel like I'm getting a fuller understanding. There's kind of a two-part thing here. On the one hand, there's measuring empathic responses among those who perhaps are at some distance from the trauma. How empathic might they be when faced with the trauma of another, perhaps? On the other hand, there's the more therapeutic sort of side of it, and that's why we're kind of thinking, for example, I have links with, and I've shared it with folks here, links with a clinic that's really tapped the market in Canada on psychotherapy. And they're already doing virtual reality therapy as exposure therapy, right? And they're doing it with people who have suffered traumas, interpersonal traumas, they're suffering addictions, and so on. And so this is kind of another angle.
You would use their research subjects virtually as your research subject. Is that the idea? I'm not sure. I mean, the issues of medical records might make that a little difficult.
I
But
guess I have a question for Andrew. I mean, from your point of view, do you think both can be done in one research project?
I would say, given that I don't think you can do the first one here very easily, I would do the second one. I mean, the second one is an eminently doable research project,
Thank you.
and you could carry it out, unless you had a population that, I mean, you know, Mansa may have access to a population that's not here, but then you'd have to go and work with them in former Yugoslavia or whatever. You have a population, but they're not here.
One of the examples I'm thinking, there are many possibilities with many traumatic the group of people. But one thing, one example that I'm thinking is, I have thought actually for the last few years, is that the VR film that I showed, the Bloodless, that is a VR film about the South Korean comfort woman who worked for American soldiers in the South Korea. And there is this center in South Korea which supports the former American comfort woman. And they have this good intention to heal the trauma of them, but they don't have these knowledges or technologies, or they didn't have the idea of using these kind of new technologies for this purpose. And nowadays, like, these great artists are making these films, and how can we use these kind of films and experiences for this group of people? And of course, like, if we come here, we'll stay here, but it does not mean that, first, we cannot work with other people in other countries. Second, it does not mean that we can not invite them, or we cannot visit there, like, sometimes. So I think there's a lot of collaborative kind of possibility of working, like
If you look here, I'm sure you can find populations that are suffering trauma in Tumen. I mean, the question is whether you can have access to, I don't know, beaten women or whatever. I mean, there's trauma. There's more than enough trauma to go around, as long as you don't focus on, like, some historical event, but on actual day-to-day trauma in people's lives. That's easy enough to find here as it is anywhere else. So you could do that if you wanted to.
Carlos.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that I think it's a very legit criticism, because I was having the same problem during our conversations before, right? And I was trying to push for the idea that we should prioritize the measurement of empathy development over the clinical aspect. But I also think that we can make the clinical aspect work, but we need to think that through much more. As it stands right now, we should focus primarily on what is immediately realistic, which would be empathy development, in my opinion.
Alexander.
Yeah, my question would be also concerning the experimental design. But actually, you might even interpret that in more broad sense. So, as far as I understand, you're going to stimulate your subjects with artworks of two different kinds, VR and not VR, right? And then you're going to measure different things connected with empathy or something. And my question actually concerns how you're going to discern effects which are caused by this shift from VR to 2D video from purely artistic effects. I mean, you could have just poorly done VR stimulus and genuinely done 2D stimulus, and in that case, you're measuring. In that case, you could, for example, come to the conclusion that there will be no difference in measures, right? But just due to the fact that you're dealing with, the film which is done by Spielberg, for example, and the VR which is done by, I don't know, my daughter, for example, kid, yeah.
Which one's traumatized? But I mean, the film example is right, because that's Zhang Yimou, the crouching tiger.
Please use the microphone.
And also, sorry.
Yeah, and this is actually even more general question. I mean, there are few art studies people in your team, right? And I think that this deliverable, if you would find an answer to that question, you probably do not have to try to answer just right now, because it's impossible. But if you would make contribution of that kind, that would help a lot of other experimenters to apply this methodology when designing their experiments? Or maybe if you have actually already answers or some comments on that, then it would be very good.
Yeah, no, I'll answer about the first point you made. Thank you so much for the great question. But we actually, it's not hard to, I think, transform the VR film, like VR film already made, into 2D version. It's possible. It's easy actually, because like the VR film actually covers 360 degrees, right? And then what we need is to compare exactly. Like we don't need to choose one film with great director and another film. Like we need to transform like this 4D or the 360 degree VR film into 2D version just by selecting the frame. And then we just make the audiences or
that's cooking the books. That's totally cooking the books, because the thing was originally made to work in one format, and now you're making it in another format that it wasn't made to work in. Of course, it's going to be less effective. You know that to start with. I mean, so that doesn't strike me as being a very good experimental design.
I think Sky's trying to think on his feet, which I appreciate. And I was kind of, you really have the wheels turning here, because I'm thinking, you know, what are VR aesthetics could be another part of this problem that has not been. I mean, there is discourse around this, so that needs to be part of what we're looking at. But yeah, we haven't discussed it, so thank you. This is excellent.
Andre?
Yeah, I have the question in the same direction. So it's not the first time that a new art form or new medium has been invented. Nobody has ever done research that would prove that cinema is more conducive of empathy as opposed to literature, or vice versa. Why? Because it's impossible to do, I think. So if it hasn't been done with, although a lot of people try to think, oh, cinema is a new medium, it's more immersive, it's more kind of, you know, indexical, right? Therefore, apparently effects should be different, right? But I don't think any meaningful research consists in saying, well, literature is more healing than cinema, or cinema is more healing than literature as a medium. Precisely because of all the reasons that have been mentioned. So I think the same is going to be about VR versus traditional media.
But you could do good VR versus bad VR, right? That you could do.
I would say that.
Well, you could figure out what is good VR and what is bad VR that way. So that's an experiment you could actually design.
But one thing I am drawing on, Andre, and you'll understand this, and I apologize if other people don't know the debates around melodrama. There has been cross-media discussions about how melodrama works on stage as literature or on film, and so the body genres debates, which are basically that your body will mirror. They don't use the word empathy, but the idea is that your body mirrors the experience of horror or of pain, of suffering. So I think that there are a lot of discussions about that in cinema, literature, drama. It might be good to bring VR into those discussions then. Might be a good way to do it.
Liz.
That if I understand well, as an outsider, this experimental design thing can be solved by using both ways. So material which was film and then transformed this VR, and then VR which is transformed to film, and then using not one but more. So it is a it is a question which can be solved. Of course, it needs work, and yeah.
Alexander.
So what I'd like to suggest is might not work that well with empathy-related issues, but from what I know, it's a very hot topic in science, and it can be appreciated in SAS because it deals with education as well. So in the medical world, again, based on what I know, there is this problem of what is the difference between something being done in VR and something being done outside of VR. In particular, surgeons are being trained to do surgeries, operations in VR. And so the question is, kind of how does this kind of methodology of teaching change their actual surgeon experience in the future? So is this education good, bad, or whatever? Like generally, what are the real differences and consequences of teaching them using VR. So maybe you should not be kind of initiating traumatic experiences in VR and not in VR yourself, but probably this kind of difference in behavior or in consequences can be studied in one way or another.
Some students are traumatized by online education. What happens if their teacher is online but they have to come here, as was the past 2 weeks? Stanimir.
Should I ask or should I first answer? I don't know.
I have a very short question. Is empathy rational? Because if you look at empathy as rational or irrational, you have very different hypotheses and very different results.
Carlos.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting question. And I think that the answer is that there is a component of empathy that has to do with rationality. If we understand by empathy, cognitive empathy, meaning when accomplished, cognitive empathy results in an enhancement of the understanding of why people feel the way they feel. So in that sense, you have to use some sort of rationality to come to that understanding. However, there is also a purely emotional and sensory side, which is called emotional empathy. And in that sense, that doesn't really imply the development of an understanding of why the person feels the way it feels. And so, yeah, I think there is a rational component of empathy, but that doesn't mean empathy, it can be reduced to rationality.
Louis.
I would say from a biological point of view, there is a strong link between rationality and empathy, because both help human being to survive and to have better success. So.
Okay, that was a comment. Are there any other questions to this theme? Project, I'm sorry.
Maybe, if I may, a very quick one. So if we're looking at the second project, so the relation between, or the interaction between VR and public deliberation, does trauma still play any role there, or is that silently now being left aside?
No, I think trauma is essential element. I mean, as we were discussing, possible topics we can include is obviously COVID is causing universal trauma, so that's becoming a topic which the policymakers should address. And since it's something very new, so know what are the regulations or the policies should be. So I think deliberation would be essential here.
Carlos?
Yeah. I just wanted to touch up on a previous comment. I think on surgery and performance, right? I think performance tasks will be very interesting for us to measure the effects of our experiments, because otherwise we are just left with resorting to measuring the empathy enhancement by asking questions on subjective feelings. And we can do that with multiple choice questions, open-ended questions that ask participants to reflect critically on how they feel after the experiment. But I think a performance task way of measuring the effect of the experiment is actually a more accurate, perhaps objective way of going about it. So I'm not saying we should choose one rather than the other, but we should definitely take into account that performance task is an available option.
Okay. Do we have one last question? Andre.
Yeah, thank you. I have a question to Mansa, because exactly, especially in the connection with the art, right? And the expertise in art. How do you see your role in this study?
There it goes. I mean, both on the level of production, but also on the level of curatorial work in terms of selection of artists, working with different visual topics, thinking about how placement of things, thinking about the environment itself where the project will take place. So like looking at all these different variables and figuring out how to build these spaces.
So you will be creating exhibitions?
Sorry?
You will be curating exhibitions?
Not curating exhibitions, but curating spaces where these projects or these experiments can take place. You can curate more than just art in terms of and exhibitions, and I'm using and applying the methods of curatorial practice to the experiment and how to build the experiment.
Yeah, all right. So I think just to better understand, can you give an example of a space you could create for
Oh no,
one
absolutely.
kind of experiment?
No, absolutely. Thinking about what is in the space, how the person will enter the space, what kind of lighting is used, the size of the images, relation to how the images are placed. If we're talking about the 2D aspect of the project, if we're talking about a 3D aspect of the project, whether it takes place in a hallway, small room, large room, size of the ceilings, things like that.
Okay, and what will be kind of guiding your design? What will be guiding your decision whether it's a big window, small window?
The discussions we'll be having and the kind of like preliminary literature review, all of that will feed into the kind of building of these spaces.
So that is that you will create alternative spaces, one to maximize the empathy, for example, and another to minimize the empathy.
No, absolutely not. Like, well, yes, essentially we will have one that will be working, as we said, in 2D and one that will be working with 3D. But I mean, my perspective on like interdisciplinarity is exactly that, like the application and use of these, of us working with our own skill sets, working together, looking through literature review, me learning different things. It's like applying my knowledge to different things, creates new knowledge, essentially because the way I observe things is going to be very different from them. And that's what makes it an interesting collaboration.
Mm-hmm. One other thing that Manza left out, because I think she was trying to address this from a primarily interdisciplinary and collaborative perspective, but she's the only one among us that knows people currently working in VR art and some of the most, I think, what I've seen is critically acclaimed VR, immersive VR artists. So bringing those people into these discussions and putting us into contact with them as well.
Okay, thank you very much for this project. And I guess that's it for the PDS 21. Andrei, do you want to say some final words?
I want to say some final words, yeah, for the PDS 21. Before we all head to the restaurant, everybody is invited, by the way. I think everybody who is in this room at this point is invited to join us at Potasku restaurant nearby. We are going to have the final dinner. Not exactly final, because there is another day tomorrow, but that's about teaching, right? The last day of the PDS is a project design session. So, yeah, judgment day. So I think that many of us enjoyed the discussions, especially yesterday and today. I think they were worthwhile by their own sake. One thing that I observed, that there are a lot of intersections between the teams. And this is very interesting. This is not something we observed before. So usually there were very different projects, and even if projects themselves were more or less coherent, there was no connection, obviously, between, except maybe very general ones between different projects. But here, you can exactly say, well, these people can actually benefit from free will research, or people who do VR can actually benefit from people who do unnaturally human, because it's also about perception, right, and going beyond the kind of usual senses and whatever. So it's interesting that the school automatically, right, I mean, we didn't do anything specifically to design that. It wasn't not designed. Right, but it kind of moves, I think, in the direction of a more coherent intellectual space where people do things which relate to each other, as opposed to very different projects. And I think this is a very interesting process and very good process, because it kind of increases the possibility of not just our teams working better, but also as people working between several projects at the same time, and and going beyond this. Because we in the school abolished departments, rather we didn't create the academic departments in the first place in order to prevent faculty from segmenting into disciplinary departments, right? But then we faced the segmentation into these teams, right? But I think today and yesterday, in this past 3 days, actually, we made a move towards less divisions between these faculty offices where each team is sitting. And I hope that we will be making offers, and I hope people will be accepting our offers and will join us here, those who are not yet here institutionally, and they will help us create a more vibrant and more mutually stimulating academic environment. So thank you everybody for your work for these 3 days.
And thank you very much, Machiel, for joining us. Thank you, Carlos. Thanks, Enrique. Thanks, Mazen. And thanks, Jay. Goodbye.
Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Good luck.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Machiel. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. My pleasure. Have
Thank
fun.